On August 4th, 1962, the world lost Marilyn Monroe. But what if her death was no accident? She was born into obscurity, a child wrapped not in silk but in uncertainty, on June 1st, 1926, in Los Angeles. The hospital where she entered the world was unremarkable, a place where babies arrived and disappeared into ordinary lives. But this baby was different, though no one knew it then. She came into life as Norma Jean Mortensen, and with that name came a storm of instability that would never leave her. Her father was a phantom, his identity cloaked in rumors. Some whispered that he was a film executive, others that he was merely a shadow who fled before she could ever open her eyes. Her mother, Gladys, was fragile, torn apart by mental instability, and unable to hold her daughter's life together. Norma Jean's childhood was not filled with lullabies and bedtime stories. It was a carousel of foster homes, orphanages, and strangers' faces. She was shuffled from one set of guardians to another, never long enough to feel safe, never secure enough to believe in permanence. At times, her mother appeared like a ghost, but the bond was fractured by instability. For a child, such disarray is a wound that never fully heals. Norma Jean grew up with that wound inside her, a hollow place where love should have been done in the midst of this chaos. She developed a peculiar skill. She learned how to smile when she was breaking, how to pretend when reality was unbearable, how to charm when she needed protection. These tools, honed in the crucible of survival, would one day make her irresistible to millions. But back then, she was simply a lonely girl constructing masks to hide her pain. Hollywood was close. The glittering sign on the hills was a constant reminder that dreams could be manufactured just a few miles away. But to a girl like Norma Jean, Hollywood might as well have been a castle surrounded by walls too high to climb. She admired it from a distance, imagining herself in gowns, adored by millions, yet it remained out of reach. At 16, she faced another twist in her fate. To escape the orphanage system that threatened to reclaim her, she married James Doherty, a man older and more stable than her chaotic life. It was less a marriage of love and more an arrangement of survival. While Doherty went off to war, Norma Jean began to blossom. She posed for photographs, her youthful beauty catching the eye of photographers hungry for faces that could inspire soldiers and sell magazines. One day, while working in a munitions factory, fate intervened again. A photographer scouting for women to feature in wartime promotional material noticed her. The factory floor was filled with smoke, machines clanging, but Norma's face was like a beam of light piercing through. The camera adored her, and when the first photographs were developed, a new identity began to take shape. Modeling agencies soon called. With platinum hair, bright lips, and a name carefully rebranded by Hollywood's machinery, Norma Jean Mortensen began to fade, replaced by the shimmering mirage of Marilyn Monroe. The transformation wasn't merely cosmetic. It was alchemical. She was no longer a foster child or an abandoned daughter. She was a star in the making, but becoming Marilyn Monroe required sacrifices. She studied how to walk, how to tilt her head, how to let her laughter sparkle like champagne. Studio handlers molded her into a symbol of sensuality, a glowing embodiment of what men desired and what women envied. Yet every lesson pulled her further away from who she really was. The mask grew thicker, and the girl beneath it, Norma Jean, began to vanish into shadows. Hollywood in the late 1940s and early 1950s was not a place of kindness. It was a machine that chewed up the vulnerable and spit out the forgotten. Marilyn was dazzling, but she was also fragile. Her earliest roles were small, fleeting glimpses on screen, but even in those moments, the audience was captivated. There was something about her, something both innocent and dangerous, something you couldn't look away from. Behind the screen, however, Marilyn's journey was not charmed. Executives promised her roles in exchange for nights she didn't want to. Div. Rumors of casting couches and late-night calls circulated. Some true, others exaggerated, but all part of the same grim reality. Hollywood was a predator, and Marilyn was its prey. She played the game because she had no choice. The dream was always just ahead of her, and she was willing to endure humiliation if it meant touching the stardom she craved. Her marriage to Doherty fell apart under the strain of her transformation. The girl he had married was gone, replaced by a woman who belonged not to him, but to the world. Marilyn Monroe was becoming an icon, and icons rarely make good wives. By 1953, she was everywhere. Gentlemen prefer blondes catapulted her into the stratosphere. With her platinum hair, dazzling smile, and unforgettable performance of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, Marilyn became more than an actress, and she became a phenomenon. Posters of her sold by the thousands, her films made millions, and her image became synonymous with beauty and desire. But with every cheer from the crowd, Marilyn sank deeper into the prison of her persona. At night, she would cry alone. She longed to be taken seriously as an actress, not just as a sex symbol. She enrolled in acting classes, studying with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York, desperate to prove she was more than a pretty face. But Hollywood resisted. They wanted Marilyn Monroe, the fantasy, not Norma Jean, the woman. She also began to rely more heavily on pills. Sleeping pills to quiet the storm of her mind, barbiturates to help her escape the loneliness, stimulants to drag her back into the relentless demands of her career. Doctors prescribed them freely, unaware or uncaring of the dangerous cocktail. They were feeding her. The line between relief and addiction blurred, and Marilyn began her slow descent into dependence. Yet the world only saw the glamorous exterior. To millions, she was the embodiment of joy, sexuality, and beauty. But inside, she was unraveling. She often spoke of feeling like she was two different people. Marilyn Monroe, the goddess adored by the world, and Norma Jean, the abandoned girl no one wanted. The conflict consumed her, and the more famous she became, the lonelier she felt. And then came the men. Joe DiMaggio, the baseball legend, strong, protective, yet deeply possessive. Their marriage was a whirlwind, a collision of two icons. At first, it seemed like a fairy tale, America's favorite athlete and Hollywood's brightest star. But behind closed doors, their love turned volatile. Joe resented the way the world ogled Marilyn, hated the revealing dresses, despised the famous subway scene in The 7-Year Itch. He wanted a wife, not a goddess. Marilyn wanted love, but not a cage. Their marriage ended in divorce after only 9 months. But Joe's presence would never fully leave her life. Her next marriage was to playwright Arthur Miller, an intellectual whose brilliance captivated her. For Marilyn, Miller represented stability, intelligence, and respect. She believed he saw her as Norma Jean, not just Marilyn. But even this marriage became strained. Her insecurities, his disillusionment, and the pressures of her career cracked their bond. Marilyn's dependence on pills worsened, and the love she longed for seemed forever out of reach. By the late 1950s, Marilyn Monroe was at the peak of her fame, but also at the edge of collapse. Her behavior on set grew erratic. She was often late, sometimes hours, sometimes not arriving at all. Directors grew frustrated. Co-stars lost patience. But no one dared abandon her because when she was on screen, she was magic. And in the shadows, rumors grew darker. Whispers of affairs with powerful men whose names could never appear in the papers. Politicians, presidents, brothers. Men whose secrets she carried. Secrets that would one day make her more dangerous dead than alive. Marilyn Monroe had become more than an actress. She had become a symbol, but symbols don't live long. And as the 1960s dawned, the countdown toward her final act began. By the early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe was no longer just a star. She was an empire of desire, a myth walking in high heels, a fantasy made flesh. Yet beneath the glitter of premieres and magazine covers, the woman herself was unraveling. The mask of Marilyn was dazzling, but inside, Norma Jean was crumbling. She had achieved everything she once dreamed of: fame, wealth, adoration, but it had all come at a price. She was surrounded by people who wanted pieces of her, studios demanding more films, agents demanding publicity, men demanding affection, fans demanding perfection. Everyone wanted Marilyn. Few cared about Norma. Her personal life was an endless storm. Her marriage to Arthur Miller, once thought to be her anchor, had deteriorated. Miller, the intellectual playwright, had grown frustrated with Marilyn's emotional volatility and dependency on pills. He began to write plays that mirrored their disintegrating relationship, leaving Marilyn feeling exposed, betrayed, and humiliated. She had wanted to be love for her soul. Instead, she became a muse for her own despair. On film sets, she was increasingly unpredictable. She would arrive hours late, sometimes not at all, her fragile state infuriating directors and co-stars. Yet when the cameras rolled, the magic returned. Marilyn's screen presence was like a drug impossible to capture without enduring her chaos. Everyone complained, but no one could deny her magnetism. Hollywood had given her fame, but it had also trapped her in a gilded cage. The studio system dictated her every move, and she often felt like a puppet on strings, controlled by men in suits. To break free, she founded her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, a bold move for a woman in an industry dominated by men. But independence only brought more pressure, more enemies, and more resentment from the powers who had built her image. At night, her loneliness deepened. The bottles of pills beside her bed multiplied. Doctors supplied her with barbiturates, tranquilizers, stimulants, whatever she asked for. The dangerous cocktail blurred her days into restless nights, her nights into endless fog. She could not sleep without pills, could not wake without them. Each dose promised relief, yet dragged her closer to the abyss. And in the background, shadows moved. Marilyn's name began to be linked in whispers to the most powerful men in America: John F. Kennedy, the charismatic young president, and his brother Robert, the ambitious attorney general. Rumors of affairs circulated quietly among insiders. Rumors that Marilyn was not merely Hollywood's goddess, but also the secret lover of the nation's leaders. The rumors were never confirmed, but there were signs. The most infamous came on May 19, 1962, at Madison Square Garden, a birthday celebration for President Kennedy. The lights dimmed and the crowd hushed. Marilyn appeared, shimmering in a skin-tight gown sewn with thousands of crystals, the fabric so sheer it clung to her like a second skin. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice breathless, sultry, trembling with both seduction and fragility. "Happy birthday, Mr. President." Those words, sung in a way that blurred the line between performance and intimacy, sent ripples through the room and through history. It was not just a song. It was a statement, a whisper of something forbidden, a glimpse into a relationship that could never be admitted, but could not be ignored. After that night, Marilyn was no longer just Hollywood's starlet. She was entangled in the political web of America's most powerful family. The Kennedys were untouchable, and anyone who threatened their image became a liability. Marilyn, with her instability, her dependence on pills, and her tendency to confide in friends and notebooks, was a dangerous liability indeed. Those close to her began to notice changes. She spoke of feeling watched, of being followed. She hinted that she knew secrets that could ruin powerful men. Her home phone was allegedly tapped. Strange figures were seen near her house. Friends later testified that she seemed paranoid, yet perhaps she wasn't paranoid at all. Perhaps she was right. Her career, too, was spiraling. She was fired from her last film, Something's Got to Give, after repeated absences and breakdowns on set. The studio grew tired of her unpredictability and threatened to blacklist her. For Marilyn, who had built her identity on being wanted, being discarded was the ultimate terror dot. Yet despite it all, she still longed for love. She clung to Joe DiMaggio, who, despite their failed marriage, never truly left her life. He checked in, worried for her, protective in ways no one else was. He wanted her to leave Hollywood, to step away from the madness, but Marilyn could not. She was trapped between the need for adoration and the desire for peace. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn was teetering on the edge. Friends said she seemed both hopeful and haunted. She spoke of new projects, new beginnings, yet also confessed fears that she would not survive much longer. She was a woman pulled in every direction, her life a fragile web ready to tear. And then came the night of August 4th, 1962, the night the world lost Marilyn Monroe. But the world would not lose her quietly. For what happened that night and in the hours after would ignite one of the most enduring mysteries in Hollywood history. A mystery filled with contradictions, cover-ups, and secrets so dark that even decades later, people wonder, did Marilyn Monroe die by her own hand, or was she silenced? The stage was set for her final act, and when the curtain fell, nothing would ever be the same again. The night of August 4th, 1962, unfolded like a script no one would dare to write, and yet, it became the final chapter of Marilyn Monroe's life. Her home in Brentwood was quiet, secluded, and dimly lit. Friends said she had been restless that week, her moods shifting like the tide, sometimes cheerful, sometimes withdrawn, always with the lingering sense of something unresolved. She had been fired from Something's Got to Give, yet she had also recently spoken of reconciling with 20th Century Fox. Some said she was hopeful. Others said she was broken. That Saturday evening, Marilyn spoke to several people on the phone. She called her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. She spoke with her publicist. She tried to reach Joe DiMaggio Jr., who later admitted they had talked about visiting her soon. Each call painted a picture of a woman searching for connection, her voice fragile yet determined. At around 10:30 p.m., her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, noticed the lights still on in Marilyn's bedroom. Hours passed, but the actress remained inside, silent. Concerned, Murray called Dr. Greenson, who arrived at the house close to midnight. Together, they broke into her locked bedroom, and there she was, Marilyn Monroe, the most luminous star in Hollywood, lay face down on her bed, a phone in her hand, an empty bottle of barbiturates on the nightstand. She was 36 years old. At 3:30 a.m., the Los Angeles Police Department received the call. The official report would later conclude that she had died of acute barbiturate poisoning, a probable suicide. It seemed like the tragic end to a troubled life, yet nothing about that night was simple. From the moment her body was discovered, contradictions, oddities, and suspicious details began to surface. Neighbors reported seeing strange vehicles parked near Marilyn's home that night. Witnesses claimed there was unusual activity long before. The official timeline suggested. Some said her body had been moved, the scene altered. Even the position in which she was found raised questions. How could she have ingested such a lethal dose and neatly replaced the bottle beside her? The coroner's report deepened the mystery. Marilyn's organs, particularly her stomach and intestines, showed no signs of pill residue. If she had swallowed so many capsules, where were they? Some suggested that the drugs had been administered by enema or injection, though no needle marks were reported. Others whispered that the autopsy had been deliberately inconclusive, a curtain drawn across an uncomfortable truth. And then came the political shadows. By then, rumors of Marilyn's affairs with John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had grown louder. Whispers claimed that both men had visited her in the weeks before her death. Some alleged that Robert Kennedy himself was in Los Angeles that very weekend, seen entering and leaving her home. The suggestion was explosive. Had Marilyn known too much? Friends recalled her speaking of confidential conversations, of secrets, casually shared by powerful men who trusted her intimacy. She allegedly wrote these details in a red diary, a notebook that was never found. If such a diary existed, it could have contained state secrets, nuclear plans, political scandals, and evidence of affairs that could destroy reputations. Some believe it vanished the night she died. The theories multiplied. One suggested that Marilyn had threatened to hold a press conference to reveal her relationships with the Kennedys. Such an announcement could have ended political careers, endangered national security, and embarrassed the presidency. If true, then silencing her became not a matter of tragedy, but of necessity. Another theory pointed toward organized crime. Marilyn's ties to Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack had linked her indirectly to mob figures. If she became too much of a liability, could the mob have intervened, both to silence her and to send a message to the Kennedys, with whom they also had dealings? And still, another theory returned to Hollywood itself. Studios, tired of her unpredictability, could have staged a cover-up, fearing financial ruin from her scandals. Executives, already frustrated with her production delays, had reason to ensure. The myth of Marilyn Monroe ended before it destroyed the business empire she fueled. The inconsistencies in her death continued to puzzle investigators, journalists, and fans for decades. Why was her housekeeper doing laundry in the middle of the night, just hours after Marilyn's death? Why were there delays in contacting the police? Why did the first officers on the scene recall her bedroom looking staged, almost as though it had been prepared for discovery? Perhaps the most chilling detail was the phone clutched in her hand. Was she trying to call for help in her final moments? Was she speaking to someone when her life ended? Or had the phone been placed there after the fact to complete the narrative of a lonely suicide? The world mourned, but it also speculated. Newspapers ran obituaries that spoke of depression and loneliness, but between the lines, questions burned. Fans refused to believe their goddess had taken her own life. Friends insisted she had been planning for the future, too full of projects, and hopes to have given up. And as the coffin closed, the myth of Marilyn Monroe only grew darker, heavier with secrets. She was no longer just a star who had burned too bright. She was now a puzzle, an unsolved riddle at the crossroads of Hollywood glamour and political power in the years that followed. Investigations were reopened, witnesses came forward, tapes and documents surfaced, all deepening the mystery rather than solving it. Marilyn Monroe's death was no longer a tragedy. It was a conspiracy, but the truth remained buried, just like the red diary that was said to have vanished into thin air. And so the legend continued. Did Marilyn die at her own hand? Or was she silenced because she knew too much? The curtain had fallen, but the whispers were louder than ever. And the next act of her story, the math, the investigations, the cover-ups would only blur the line between fact and fiction even more. The morning after Marilyn Monroe's death, the news spread like wildfire across the globe. Headlines screamed tragedy. Photographs of her Brentwood home flooded the press. To the public, it was the shocking end of a star whose beauty seemed eternal. But behind the flashing cameras, something darker was unfolding. The official narrative was simple: suicide by overdose. Yet from the very beginning, cracks appeared. The police report was oddly incomplete. Timelines conflicted. Witnesses contradicted one another. And most unsettling of all, people who were closest to Marilyn that night told versions of events that didn't quite match Dr. Ralph Greenson. Her psychiatrist claimed he broke into her room around midnight and found her lifeless. Eunice Murray, her housekeeper, said she noticed something was wrong hours earlier. Later, Murray's story shifted again and again. At one point, years later, she even admitted on camera that the Kennedys were involved. Whether it was the truth or the ramblings of an aging woman remains uncertain, but the inconsistency only deepened suspicion. The LAPD quickly labeled the death probable suicide, closing the case with remarkable speed. But behind closed doors, law enforcement and politicians alike were uneasy. For if Marilyn Monroe's connections to President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy were ever confirmed, the scandal would shake the very foundation of American politics. Whispers grew that Robert Kennedy had been in Los Angeles the night of Marilyn's death. Some witnesses swore they saw him entering her home, accompanied by men who looked like security guards. Others insisted he was miles away. The conflicting testimonies blurred into a fog of uncertainty. Yet the mere possibility that Kennedy had been present was enough to warrant silence. Then came the missing evidence. Marilyn's phone records from that night vanished. The alleged red diary, where she was said to have written down secrets shared by the Kennedys, was never found. Even items in her home reportedly disappeared before the police arrived. Who took them? And why? The coroner's office, under immense pressure, released findings that raised more questions than answers. High levels of barbiturates were found in her bloodstream, yet no residue appeared in her stomach. If she had swallowed dozens of pills, shouldn't there have been traces? Some doctors suggested the drugs could have been administered rectally or by injection, though no injection. Marks were visible. The lack of clarity fueled endless speculation. Was the autopsy rushed, manipulated, or deliberately obscured? Reporters who dared to probe too deeply found themselves stonewalled. Sources dried up, files disappeared, doors closed. It was as if an invisible hand had drawn a line that could not be crossed. For decades, journalists would circle the same evidence, the same rumors, never able to push beyond the wall of secrecy. And then there were the tapes. Years later, rumors emerged of recording secret surveillance of Marilyn's home by government, agencies, or even the mob. Some claimed that wiretaps captured conversations between her and the Kennedys. Others whispered of tapes from the night of her death, evidence that could expose everything. But like the Red Diary, these recordings never surfaced publicly. Were they destroyed, hidden, or fabricated? The uncertainty only fed the legend. In the wake of her death, those who loved Marilyn mourned deeply. Joe DiMaggio arranged her funeral, keeping Hollywood elites and political figures at bay. He blamed the people around her, the users, the manipulators, the men who had taken what they wanted and discarded her. For 20 years after her death, DiMaggio sent roses to her grave 3 times a week. He never forgave those he believed had destroyed her. But beyond grief, suspicion hardened into conspiracy. Some believed Marilyn had threatened to expose her affair with President Kennedy, potentially endangering his political career. Others thought Robert Kennedy had tried to sever ties with her and silence her knowledge of state secrets. Still others argued it was the mob, retaliating against the Kennedys by eliminating their glamorous liability. Each theory carried pieces of truth, yet none could be proven. Witnesses contradicted one another. Evidence vanished, and time itself began to erode clarity, leaving only fragments of a puzzle no one could solve. By the 1970s, public distrust of the government had grown, fueled by scandals like Watergate. In this climate, Marilyn's death was re-examined by conspiracy theorists and journalists alike. Books were written, documentaries produced, each promising revelations. each offering conflicting narratives. Some declared suicide, others murder, still others something in between, an accidental overdose covered up to protect reputations. The mystery only deepened because Marilyn Monroe was not just a person, she was an icon. Her death symbolized more than tragedy. It symbolized betrayal, the corruption of power, and the darkness beneath Hollywood's golden glow. To this day, her case is revisited again and again, as though somewhere in the shadows, the truth still waits to be uncovered. But if there is one truth, it is this: Marilyn Monroe knew things she was never supposed to know. And in the summer of 1962, that knowledge may have sealed her fate. The world would never look at her the same way again. Her image remained immortal, but behind the smile, a haunting question lingered: who wanted Marilyn gone, and why? And yet, even in death, she was not free. For in the decades to follow, her memory would be twisted, exploited, and reshaped as Hollywood and history itself struggled to control the narrative of the woman who had become legend. Marilyn Monroe was buried on August 8, 1962, in a modest ceremony at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. The crowd was small, carefully curated by Joe DiMaggio, who barred Hollywood elites and Washington power brokers alike. He believed they had all exploited her, drained her, and left her to die. In the years to come, his grief hardened into devotion. For 2 decades, roses appeared at Marilyn's crypt, sent by Joe 3 times a week without fail. But though her body was laid to rest, her story was not. If anything, it had only begun. Almost immediately after her death, whispers of foul play circulated. In the years that followed, those whispers grew into theories, and theories grew into obsessions. Investigators, journalists, biographers, and even former law enforcement officials revisited the events of that August night, each time uncovering contradictions, silences, and unanswered questions. In 1982, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office reopened the case. They combed through records, re-interviewed witnesses, and examined files that had long been buried. Yet even then, no definitive answers emerged. The conclusion remained frustratingly vague. Her death was consistent with suicide, but evidence of possible foul play could not be ruled out. Once again, the truth slipped through the cracks, and so Marilyn became something more than a woman. She became a mirror for society's darkest suspicions. Each generation projected its fears onto her story. In the 1960s, it was the Kennedys and Cold War secrets. In the 1970s, distrust of government gave rise to conspiracies of CIA involvement, cover-ups, and silenced witnesses. By the 1990s, Hollywood itself was scrutinized, and its culture of exploitation, abuse, and manipulation lay bare to this day. No one truly knows what happened in Brentwood that night. Did Marilyn swallow the pills herself, crushed by despair? Did someone administer them to her, ensuring her silence forever? Or was it something in between, an accidental overdose covered up by panicked men who feared the scandal her death would unleash? The evidence is a labyrinth, twisting and turning, leading nowhere certain. But perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman in the world, became invisible in her own death. Her voice silenced, her secrets buried, her truth hidden beneath layers of lies. Yet Marilyn endures. Her face is still printed on posters, her films still watched, her name still whispered. She is a ghost woven into the fabric of Hollywood, her life and death a cautionary tale of beauty devoured by fame, of innocence corrupted by power, of a woman who belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. And always, the mystery lingers. Each book, each documentary, each revelation brings new questions, but never answers. Marilyn Monroe remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable. Maybe that is why her legend persists. For mysteries that cannot be solved become eternal. So when you look into her eyes, frozen in photographs, glowing on film reels, remember, behind that smile was a woman who carried secrets powerful enough to change history. Secrets that may have cost her everything. Marilyn Monroe did not just die. She disappeared into the shadows of power, glamour, and betrayal. And from those shadows, her ghost still speaks softly, seductively, tragically reminding us that the truth is never as simple as the story we are told. They called it suicide. A lonely woman in a locked bedroom, empty pill bottles scattered on her nightstand. But if it was truly that simple, why does the story of Marilyn Monroe still haunt us more than 60 years later? The question's never stopped. Where was Robert Kennedy on the night of August 4th, 1962? Some witnesses swore they saw him at her Brentwood home. Others insisted he was miles away. Why did the timeline shift like shadows, refusing to align? Why were Marilyn's phone records for that night erased, vanished as if they never existed? Who needed them gone so badly? And what about the infamous Red Diary, the notebook Marilyn was said to keep, where she supposedly recorded secrets whispered to her by the most powerful men in America? Nuclear plans, state conspiracies, dangerous truths that could never be made public. Did she really keep it? And if so, who stole it the night she died? Even her autopsy left more questions than answers. High levels of barbiturates in her blood, yet no pill residue in her stomach. If she swallowed so many capsules, why weren't they there? Some said the drugs were administered another way, by injection or enema, but there were no marks. Clear signs. Just more confusion. And then there is the strange choreography of the night itself. The housekeeper doing laundry in the middle of the night. The delays in calling the police. The body lying in a position that seemed staged, almost posed. If Marilyn had died alone and unnoticed, why does the scene look like a story carefully written for others to find? Each question pulls us deeper, each contradiction tightening the knot. So what really happened? Theory 1. Suicide. Marilyn was fragile, emotionally unstable, reliant on barbiturates to sleep, to cope, to breathe through the chaos of her life. Friends said she was depressed, overwhelmed by rejection, by failed marriages, by the collapse of her latest film. Perhaps that night, she simply took too many pills, and her body could not survive it. But does that explain the missing evidence? The odd behavior of those around her? The silence that fell so quickly, so forcefully after her death? And her ghost still lingers, whispering through history, reminding us that sometimes the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows.